In the last module, we spoke about natural selection, and we saw why diversity was such an important component of natural selection occurring and allowing individuals to adapt to their environment. So let's talk a little bit more about biodiversity and ways that ecologists study biodiversity. So there are 1.8 million species of living things on Earth. So 1.8 million of them have been described by ecologists and scientists so far. And they estimate that this is a very small percentage of the total number of species that exist on Earth. Maybe that number could be as high as 10 or even 200 million species. Tropical forests have some of the largest biodiversity and the highest concentration of species, but because they're being cut down at such an alarming rate that we are probably losing a lot of species that we've never even encountered to begin with. So we are having a huge effect on species extinction, and I hope that you learned from the last module why diversity was such an important element for individual species and also for just the ecological network on Earth to function properly in general. So you remember trophic structures, we have primary producers, primary consumers, right, and so on and so forth, basically food chains on some level. And food chains are a really good way to look at how individual species interact with each other, right, how they interact through predation or other ways they interact with each other, mostly predation. If we affect one component of the food chain, that throws the whole food chain off kilter. So if we take away something on the top of the food chain, so for example, if we take away whales, the species that is normally predated by whales might increase in numbers, right? The krill might become very, very abundant because they don't have any natural predators anymore. So that's a concept that hopefully you've heard of already, but that just really demonstrates how when we introduce a lack of balance into the food chain, things can go pretty wrong, and will and do go very wrong for us as humans as well, because we are affected by all of the food chains on Earth. So when we look at population ecology, we're looking at every aspect of a population, right? So what are the distribution of the individuals? How old are they? How well are they reproducing? How many progeny do they produce on average? Density, distribution, age, population size, etc. So we are ecologists. Let's start looking at all of these different elements and what they mean. So density is the number of individuals per unit area. Dispersion is the way that the individuals are present in the ecosystem that we're looking at. So for example, they might be all clumped together, or they might be individually, they might be equal distances from each other. We can look at species richness and species evenness, right, in a ecosystem. So how many species are present, and how evenly they are distributed in terms of numbers. And all of these elements tell us how many species are there. So when we look at the births and the deaths of individuals in the population, we're looking at what the numbers of the population are and whether or not they're reproducing faster than they are dying, or are they dying faster than they are reproducing. Also, it's important to keep in mind that the number of individuals in a population in a certain area are going to be determined by how many individuals are coming to that area or how many are leaving, right? So if resources are getting scarce, or if resources in another location are getting scarce, new individuals might be coming in, or if conditions are harsh in the location where they are, they might be moving to another location. So all of that's going to play a role in our view of the population as ecologists. So we might want to look at density of a population to begin with. That's usually where an ecologist might start. So just saying how many individuals are present. And obviously it might be very difficult, depending on the animal, for example, to count the exact number of individuals. But one way scientists have figured out how to do it is by tagging and releasing, and then they build models of how many individuals they think there are in the population and total. So for example, they do that with dolphins. They mark them and then get obtain statistics about how many, they put tags on them and release them and get statistics about how many they think there are. These are the different types of distribution. So once we count approximately how many individuals are in a population, we can look at their distribution. So random, uniform, or clumped. If you were an ecologist and you see a distribution like that looks completely uniform, what do you think is happening in that case? So those individuals might be territorial. There might be some reason why they are evenly dispersed. So maybe they fight with each other, or they're fighting over land, or some other reason they're not wanting to be close to each other. Clump distributions that, the individuals might need to be clumped for reproductive purposes or safety purposes or another purpose. So starfish, right, will clump all together for, probably safety and reproductive purposes. All right, there's some penguins, territorial penguins being evenly distributed, and random distribution is just random. And so we've looked at the number of individuals, we've looked at their density distribution. Let's look at how well they're surviving and when are they dying. So we can look at a survivorship curve to get that information. So let's look at these squirrels and look at a survivorship curve of the squirrels. So we might look at males versus females, and we can see that the males are dying earlier than the females. So that gives us important information, and we can do something with that information if we think that we're playing a role in that, if human beings are playing a role in that. So that's important information about the life cycle of these animals that we want to collect as ecologists. Different kinds of animals have different survivorship curves. So something like a mollusk, which produces millions and millions of plankton progeny, those plankton get eaten at really fast rates, and not many of them survive to be an older age, versus human beings. So most of us survive, most of these days, especially most humans survive to be, middle-aged or so, and then the survivorship curve drops off very aggressively. So we always want to keep in mind what kind of survivorship curves we are interested in or expect to see, and what the individual in what the population is like, what the nature of the population is, and why, how it's behaving. All right, so we looked at number, density distributions, we looked at survivorship. What else can we look at? We can look at reproduction. So we can create reproductive tables of individuals in a population, and you can do that, for example, with the same squirrels. So somebody, and you can go look up that paper by Sherman and Morton. Somebody got their PhD maybe, looking at how many squirrel babies each squirrel had. So here they're looking at what the age was of the squirrels, and then they average the litter size between the different individuals of that age. So it looks like here they are mean size of the litter. So it looks like the litter sizes are a little bit larger when the squirrels are a little bit younger, and looks like the number of males and females in the litters are about the same. So these are important demographics about the reproduction of the individuals in that species, and we want to gather all of that information as ecologists. We can think about what might affect the survivorship or the number of individuals in a population. We can think about the species that we're looking at and think about what kind of competition it has with other species, what kind of predators they might be subject to, other interactions that might benefit them, mutualism, symbiosis with other species, commensalism, which is if they might benefit from another species that doesn't benefit from them back. So there are a lot of different ways to study these populations, and we've gathered a lot of information about them. And because we are interested in how human beings are affecting the population growth dynamics and the population I mean, we're interested in everything, right? The density distribution of populations that human beings might be affecting, the growth rates, the death rates, the survivorship curves. We're interested in all of that, but let's address one aspect that ecologists might look at, which is just the growth of a population or the decay of a population if the population is declining, the decline of a population. So let's look at some growth models. If we look at the number of individuals in a population over time, and the birth rate and the death rate are exactly the same, we can plot the number of individuals over time, and it's going to be a straight line, right? There's not going to be any, the growth rate's going to be 0. So the population might still have, millions of individuals, but they're being born at the same rate that they're dying, so the slope here is 1, and the slope is 0, and the birth rate is 0, so it's a flat line. This is not always the case, so if we look at a population that has moved to a new area that has lots of different resources, so let's say if you read the reading about Easter Island, one of the theories one of the theories is that a factor that killed all of the palm trees on the island was rats that came with the original inhabitants on their ships. So these rats came to an island where they had no natural predators and they were not part of the original ecosystem, and they were able to take over very quickly because they loved eating the seeds from the palm trees. And the archaeologists actually find little rat bites in the seeds that have been present on the island for years and years, so there's a lot of evidence that rats could have been the reason why no trees exist on the island anymore. So let's say these rats come to an island, only a few of them were on the boat, but they come to this island where they have no natural predators and they start reproducing very rapidly, as rats do, so they might demonstrate something similar to exponential population growth. So let's look at what that looks like if we graph it. So it typically looks like a J-shaped curve, and you don't need to pay attention to those to the equations, but the J-shaped curve is a very telltale characteristic of a population that has no predators and it's just exploding in numbers, and it's reproducing very, very rapidly, and things are going very well for that species at that particular moment in time. So one example might be the rebounding of some populations of animals that were brought almost to extinction, and then we advocated for them and passed legislation to allow them to try to regain their population density. So for example, elephants were almost hunted to extinction, and then human beings passed a lot of laws to protect them, and now their population is demonstrating a exponential growth characteristic of that J shape. So someone smart, like yourself, a smart ecologist, might say, well, I don't think that is going to be able to continue forever. I doubt that the elephant population is going to continue to expand until indefinitely, and that with that high slope. So at some point, they're not going to be able to continue growing, right? We're not going to go into Manhattan and see elephants walking down Fifth Avenue, most likely. So what happens when the population can no longer continue growing that rapidly? So, there's some factors that will just not let that rapid growth sustain. Usually what happens is we hit a logistic growth. So the J kind of tapers off and we end up with an S-shaped curve. So we can see in the blue line the exponential growth, and with the red line we have logistic growth. So the population expanded and grew very rapidly and then hit a point where it couldn't keep expanding that rapidly. And now we've reached that flat line again where the death rate and the birth rate are equal. So the growth rate is 0 in that case. So that is logistic growth. And now when a population reaches that logistic growth, it's growing more slowly, and it's basically at or near its carrying capacity. So the carrying capacity is the maximum population size that environment can support. So if that happens with the elephants and we hit that flat line, that means that the environment just cannot sustain more elephants surviving under the conditions that are present at that time. So the carrying capacity is the population size at that intercept when that S-shaped curve becomes flat. So when the S-shaped curve becomes flat, that's when the population has hit its carrying capacity. So the carrying capacity of elephants might be, 200,000 elephants, right? That's the carrying capacity. So when the line is flat, the growth rate is 0, and the birth rate equals the death rate. That's a logistic growth model. So a carrying capacity, birth equals death. In the logistic population growth model, the rate of increase declines, right? As we get closer and closer to that flat line, the S becomes flatter and flatter, right? The growth rate slows down more and more. And so if you've grown beer or made wine or made yogurt or made kombucha, right? Anything that involved fermentation using yeast or bacteria or something or both, you might have some understanding of the growth rates of bacteria or yeast in a solution. So if you put yeast into your grape slurry, right, you're trying to make wine, you might see something very similar to that logistic curve. So at first you're going to put some yeast in, they have lots of sugar, they have lots of ingredients to eat and to thrive on, and they're going to grow very rapidly, and they're going to demonstrate that exponential growth. However, at some point, they're going to start running out of food, and they're going to hit that logistical shape, and they're going to flatten out, and they're going to hit their carrying capacity. So at some point, there's not going to be enough food, and their growth rate and division rates are going to be the same. Their death rate and their division rate is going to be about the same. Sometimes, in the second curve that we see here, the curve on the right, the population explodes and becomes too big for the environment to sustain, and a lot of individuals die. So what you see here is, if you look at just the dotted lines, not the red line, if we look at the dotted lines, we see that the Daphnia population exploded, became much too big, bigger than the carrying capacity, and then there was a big die-off. So a lot of them died, and then it kind of fell down again, and then at some point it's going to even out. And the red line is showing you about where the carrying capacity is going to be once everything stabilizes. So that overshoot happens in nature too, and sometimes what happens is that the population, when it undergoes that die-off after that overshoot, when everything starts dying off and the curve starts going down again, the population can't recover. So there's too many individuals dying, and if the population gets too small, they can't successfully reproduce. So, for example, in this moose population, that's exactly what happened. So they came into some new resources. Everything went really well. Maybe some of their predators were killed off. So I think wolves are one of their predators. So maybe their predators were killed off by humans. That's about the right point in time when humans were doing a lot of hunting and killing off a lot of different species. So the moose population exploded. They had no predators, and then they probably ate all of their resources. They didn't have enough food. The population just crashed and completely declined. So that overshoot really led to their demise ultimately. So we are ecologists, and we are interested in what factors are affecting all of the aspects of the population that we looked at, right? We looked at numbers and densities, and growth rates, birth rates, death rates, survivorship curves, etc., right? We've looked at the growth rate of the population. So what are the environmental factors that might affect this? So you might be able to think of some very easily off the top of your head. We have some factors which are not dependent on density, so these might be just environmental factors that are just present in the area. So floods, fires, volcanoes, temperature. These factors are not going to matter whether or not there's a high number of individuals or a low number of individuals. So these are density independent. Density dependent factors will make a difference will be different depending on how many individuals are present. So these usually will be the availability of nutrients, or availability of resources for the individuals of the population. So for example, with the moose, if what happened was that the numbers increased so much that there was a complete lack of food for the population, and a lot of the individuals were starving, then that's a density dependent factor. That is a lack of food because there were so many individuals in the population. So those are density dependent factors. So the density dependent birth and death rates are examples of negative feedback that regulate the population growth. So yeah, lack of food, disease, territoriality, predation, toxic wastes, and other factors like that, which are a lot of factors that humans play a role in for different populations that are present on Earth. So this graph is showing you that as the population size gets bigger, sometimes the pressure is so high on the individuals to survive, and this lowers their ability to reproduce, that the larger the population size in this case, so you can see as we move to the right of the curve, on the x-axis, we're going from, let's say, 300, the juveniles producing lambs is maybe high, right, maybe 60%. But if we go to a population size of 500, now only 20% of the individuals can produce lambs. So clearly a lack of resources is affecting their reproduction and their fertility. So predation is another factor that humans might play a role in. If we kill off the predators in an ecosystem, the animals that were being eaten by those predators might suddenly explode in numbers, like we saw before with the moose, and then their numbers might crash, like we saw with the moose. So here's the data from what happened. So we have the wolves. The wolves increased in number at some point. So these numbers cycled. So the wolves were keeping the moose numbers in check. Humans might have come and hunted them all down, and all of a sudden the moose population exploded, and their lack of resources might have caused them to crash. And so populations can cycle when there's predators and predatees. The populations do undergo boom and bust cycles. So for example, if we look at lynx and rabbits, there's a lynx hunting a rabbit. What a perfect picture to go with the graph that we're showing underneath, where we can see the population number. So the lines are just showing you how many individuals are in the population. So the population numbers in thousands completely cycle with each other. So as the rabbit, which is showing in blue, numbers get higher, the lynx numbers get higher as well because they have lots of food. And then the lynx might grow in numbers. There's too many of them. They eat all the rabbits. The rabbit population goes down, and then the lynx population goes down as well because they don't have any food. So when you have that kind of very simple predator-predatee relationship, you can see these populations cycle with each other very frequently.